Started. If you want to go ahead and turn to John chapter 21. We finally made it. Made it to the last chapter. And I'm planning on having one more class after this, and it's going to be centered off of verse 25, where he mentions, now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them to be written. I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. I want us to talk a little bit about that on Sunday, and I'm giving you a little bit of a homework assignment, okay? So what I want to do Sunday is basically a review of John in a sense, but I want you to come and tell me what you learned through this class, what you haven't seen before, something that stood out to you, what's some major takeaways for you, and I want us to have basically an application session on Sunday about what we've learned from the book, what's been revealed. And if you want to go back to the prologue and read the first 18 verses, we're going to walk through some of that as well, and then we'll call it a day after that. All right, let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for the time to come together. We're thankful for the blessings you give to us. And we're thankful for this church and the faithfulness and love that we have for each other. And we're thankful for all that you do. Watch over us through this day and through the study. Help us to reflect on and appreciate the lessons that are here and that we've learned throughout this letter. In your Son's name, amen. All right, so we're here in chapter 21, and if someone would like to, go ahead and read for us here verse 1. Let's go ahead and get the whole context. Just go ahead and read the whole chapter for us. Just 21 down through the end of the chapter.
After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and two others of his disciples were together. I'm going fishing, Simon Peter said to them. We're coming with you, they told him. They went out and got into the boat, and that night they caught nothing. When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore. However, the disciples did not know it was Jesus. Men, Jesus called them, you don't have any fish, do you? No, they answered. Cast the nets on the right side of the boat, he told them, and you'll find some. So they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. Therefore the disciple, the one Jesus loved, said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer garment around him, for he was stripped, and plunged into the sea. But since they were not far from land, about 100 yards away, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish lying on it and bread. Bring some of the fish you've just caught, Jesus told them. So Simon Peter got up and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. Even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Come and have breakfast, Jesus told them. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. Now it was the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Feed my lambs, he told him. A second time he asked, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, he said to him. You know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep, he told him. He asked him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved, and he asked him a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep, Jesus said. I assure you, when you were young, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hand, and someone else will tie you, and someone else will carry you where you don't want to go. He said this to signify by what kind of death he would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, follow me. So Peter turned around and saw the disciple Jesus loving. So Peter turned and saw the disciple Jesus loved following them. That disciple was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at supper and asked, Lord, who is the one that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? If I want him to remain until I come, Jesus answered, what is that to you? As for you, follow me. So the report spread to the brothers, and that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not tell him that he would not die. If I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciples who testified to these things and who wrote them down. We know that the testimony is true, and there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written by one, or written one by one, I suppose not, the word itself could contain the books that would be written.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's walk through this. And obviously all of this is basically one big scene. If you remember the structure that we've had so far in John, we had a prologue, which was the first 18 verses. Then we went into that first part of the book, the main book, that we call the Book of Signs. Then in chapter 12, chapter 13, it hinges, and then we have the Book of Glory. If y'all remember, we went through all of that, and that ended here in chapter 20. And so now we have, which is basically an epilogue. So they just kind of go hand in glove. These two fit together. So this is a special conclusion here. But what's important about this, remember, these are events that have already happened. So it's not necessarily critical for the disciples, but it is critical for us. It's critical for the people that are reading this particular gospel. So one thing that you'll notice, and it's a key word that's in this section, is the idea of revealing. And it mentions that this was the third time that he was revealed. And so these are revealing for a specific purpose, to prepare them to go out to send the message into the whole world. So we have this one last story that is very much an object lesson. So it kind of seems a little strange unless you've read some of the other Gospels, and probably most likely Luke's. All right, so as you look here at the first section, we have 7 disciples that are here, and they seem kind of disconnected. They don't maybe fully understand everything we just talked about in 20. And so you see them, and what are they interested in doing?
Going back to what they've done before.
Yeah, I mean, they don't really seem like they have a whole lot of plan. They just kind of wake up, and Peter says, hey, I'm going to go fishing. And they're, hey, we'll go with you. Okay, so it's just kind of all over the place a little bit. And then one of the people that's here, we haven't seen him since the very beginning. Who is that? There in verse 2.
Nathaniel.
Okay, yeah, so Nathaniel is here. And so remember, he was the one back there in chapter 1 that Jesus had said, you're going to see greater things than these. Do you think he saw those? He definitely did, okay? So you have all of these kind of pieces going back to what happened really there in the first chapter. So they go through and they're fishing. Jesus comes out. Now, it seems like it could have been early, just based off of verse 4. He said that the day was breaking, and Jesus is on the shore, and he says that the disciples don't know it. So it's kind of like, I mean, Johnny, you've been out there probably with Jacob. You're fishing, dew and all of that. There's a fog on the water. Maybe you can't see very well. It's really early. So they know somebody's over there, but they don't know who it is, right? And so they have not fished, or they fished all night. And Jesus says children or men. It's just kind of a more of an enduring term from what I can understand. And they asked him, basically, did you catch anything? Which is the general thing you do whenever you're fishing, right? You just ask them, hey, did you catch anything? They say no. And then he does, there's a lot of repeats here that I want us to think about here. Where are they? Okay, they're at the Sea of Galilee, and they're fishing, and Jesus is on the shore. Does any of this sound familiar? It should sound really, really familiar. What he's doing is a repeat story that's going to remind them of some very important past events. So they caught no fish, and he comes out there just as the day is breaking. And so, for some reason, they take some random advice, because the advice was to do what?
Cast the nets to the right side of the boat.
Okay, yeah, cast your nets on the other side, okay? And so they cast them over. They have this huge haul of fish. And what is John's immediate reaction?
That's the Lord.
Yeah, it's the Lord. Okay, so let's talk about this for a little bit. Why does he make this conclusion? Yeah, let's read that story, because interestingly, this goes to some of what John has already, what we've emphasized in John. Remember, there's a lot of stories that John's already expecting that you've read before. Okay? Talked about that already with Simon. We talked about that with a lot of, like Mary. And I believe this is one of the stories he had expected that you've already read. So in Luke chapter 5, somebody go over there and read for us here verses 1 through 11.
On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw two boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little bit from the land. And he sat down and he taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out under the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they were about to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. So also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him.
Okay, sound familiar? All right, so there's this story is basically in the back of their minds. Okay, you're in a very similar place, at least similar circumstances, and if you remember in Luke's gospel, this is the first time that Peter decides that he's actually going to follow Jesus. He's been with him to a certain extent to this point, but there's a reason that Jesus went through these events with them particularly. And it was to commission them to go out into all the world. And particularly, he mentions there in verse 8 about Simon Peter. And what was Simon's reaction, seeing Jesus and the multitude of fish and all of that?
He fell down on his knees and told him to go away from him because he was a sinful man.
Yeah, and so there was conviction at that moment. And it wasn't just him. You had the other disciples that were there. And particularly in verse 11, this is the big statement about them, is that they left everything and followed him. Okay? So Jesus basically comes into their life, gives them the most successful business day they ever had, and then he said, "Look, you got to leave it all and follow me." Okay? And there was a lot of things going on that particular event. Now, if we remember, this has been a few years. It's been maybe 3 years, roughly, since all of this happened. A lot of water has been under the bridge, in a sense, since all of this. And so now, back here in John 21, we have another kind of addition here that is showing the unique relationship, but it's also, it's a replay of events. So I don't know if you've ever done this. I probably should do this with my wife, but we're not going to have the opportunity to do that. But have you ever gone through and like been with your spouse and everything? Maybe it was on your 10th anniversary, 20th anniversary, 25th, something like that. And what you did is you went to the exact place where you proposed to your spouse, and you gave them the same rose, and you wore almost the same outfit, and you got down on one knee or whatever, and you said, "Would you marry me?" Why do you do that all those years later? Anybody have that story? Anybody done that? If not, husbands, that's a great idea, so go back. Well, why do you do that?
Memories and power bring back emotions, they bring back zeal.
Yeah, it's a rekindling. It's a repositioning. It's going back to that moment when you made a decision. And maybe even for you as a Christian, have you ever gone back to the place you were baptized and looked into the baptistry, or maybe it was down at a lake or something like that? I mean, you go to a place and it's more than just, hey, remember it. You're there. and you're living not only the moment that's right there in front of you, but you're living that moment from all those years ago. That's what's happening here in John chapter 21, is Jesus has taken them and has basically replayed the scenario, because in a sense, he's trying to do the exact same thing that he did in Luke chapter 5. Because now they're kind of discombobulated. They're wanting to go and fish and all of that, and he still hasn't changed what he called them for back there in Luke chapter 5. Okay? Now, another thing that is important about this that we've seen already in the book of John, and we see it in both of these cases, is how successful are these men on their own?
They're not.
Yeah, they're not. They can't do anything. But with Jesus, what happens?
They can do amazing things.
Yeah, mind-blowing, really. I mean, he lays out the 153 fish, which I'm not exactly sure why, unless it's just to say that's a ton of fish, and that would, maybe to give, number to that group of why they reacted that particular way. But this particular section is very, very important to understand what's happening here. And the reason that we should see this is these are what the Bible talks about with echoes, where you have a past event that is still being repeated, but it's different in a future event. So like when you have the Exodus or you have the Passover, that's this echoing concept. And you see it here in chapter 21. So that's why Peter responds immediately. Once he understands he sees the fish, and, the way John does, he knows exactly who it is because they're in that place. These events, I've been through this before. He doesn't even say, obviously, that he is the Lord, but he understands. Now, it's interesting, though, how Simon reacts. He puts on his outer garment, he throws himself into the sea, and then the other disciples come through and they drag the fish onto the land, even though they were but they were only about 100 yards off. All right, so that's the first kind of echo that we need to see here. Now, they come up here in verse 9, and they get up on land, and what's happening now? It's not how it was before. Same kind of things, but it's always different, right? So what's happening now in verse 9?
I saw fire with fish laying in it being cooked and bread.
Okay, all right. So, and particularly, it's a particular kind of fire. Now, we've mentioned fire generally, but we've mentioned that it was a charcoal fire. Y'all remember this? All right, so when was the last time there was a charcoal fire in the book of John?
In the priest's courtyard,
Okay, and what happened at the priest's courtyard?
Peter denied the Lord.
Okay, now also think about this. This is in John's gospel. When is the last time that Peter ate with Jesus?
At the table.
It was at the table, John 13, okay? Those are all going to come together right here at this moment, okay? So, they sit down. There's the charcoal fire, which we mentioned there's kind of an unusual scent about charcoal. I mean, I smelled some charcoal yesterday, same kind of thing. And here's the fish laid out, and there's bread. So they're about to sit down and eat. And he comes and he brings some of the fish that they just caught. And here's the 153 and all of that. And so Jesus tells them, come and have breakfast. And not a single one says, who are you? They all understand that it's the Lord. And so he goes through, he comes, he takes the bread, and he gives it to them. Sound familiar? That's what was happening in John 13. Same kind of element. He's repeating some of those kind of things. And obviously the fish is a little bit different here. But he also mentions in verse 14, how many times had Jesus revealed himself? 3 times, okay? Lots of all these kind of different connections, okay? So keep all that in your mind. Okay, so one side note before we continue on. One thing about the resurrection. We've been talking about how this has been where Jesus is still himself, but also not himself. This is one of the concepts that is verifying one of John's overall themes. Remember, he's saying that Jesus was bodily resurrected, that he was himself, all of those ideas. And so why is this particular story important about that? Yeah, he's eating. Now, apparently he doesn't have to eat. He doesn't need it to be animated. But we don't always eat just to survive. We also eat out of pleasure and all of that kind of concept. But it's showing that he wasn't just a spirit. That's part of the way Luke argues about it in chapter 24. Remember what he said? He said, a spirit does not have flesh and bones like you see that I have. And the point that he was saying is, look, I'm not just floating around a figment or anything like that. This is a bodily resurrection. He's trying to drive that concept there. So anyway, John's tying into that same idea there. Okay, so now let's talk about verse 15. But before I do that, questions, comments, thoughts so far?
Did you say that Jesus doesn't need to eat?
Like to survive is what I mean.
You don't think so?
I don't think so, just based off of he had the rib inside and the marks. I don't
I don't know how you conclude that he doesn't need to eat since he's in human form.
Okay.
Did he ever need to eat?
If he was truly human,
He needed to eat.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not a necessary conclusion from it. Okay. All right, other thoughts?
Two questions. Are
Yeah.
we supposed to see any connection here with Peter jumping in the lake and swimming to Jesus versus him stepping out onto the water when Jesus is walking on the water?
I don't know. I didn't think about that. That's an interesting.
And the fish and the bread, are we supposed to see a connection when he was feeding the people that are following him around?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that either with John 6.
A lot of imagery here.
Yeah.
A lot of imagery here.
Yeah, he's replaying a whole lot of stories.
I have to wonder because of Peter's statement to Jesus, when Jesus was washing his feet, he said, wash me head to toe, if that's what, if he with you, then wash me head to toe. And
Mhm.
Jesus said, that's enough to wash me. Peter wanted to be with Jesus in the water.
Yeah.
And when he realizes that's Jesus on the shore, he jumped into the water.
Mm-hmm.
I think it speaks to his devotion to the Lord.
Yeah. Yep.
Pretty telling.
And I think it ties into the idea of that being the third time, which we'll see some more here in just a second. Other thoughts, things you want to add?
That was my thought. It was quicker by him jumping, bailing into the water. It was quicker access to him to get to Jesus because he knew who it was. And that's where he wanted to be. They're tied up with this net full of fish, They're not gonna get there quick, so he's gonna
Yeah.
get there really quick.
And he doesn't care about the fish anymore. He's just the guy that wanted to go fishing. He's like, I don't care about the fish. Just I got to get to the Lord.
Right, and for John, he remembered, sorry, Virginia. For John, he remembered that, the initial meeting with Jesus when he told him to rise and I'll make you fishers of men. Rise and follow me. And, so it was real easy for him to, without even being able to see him, to know who it was. By the words that were spoke and the actions that were achieved with that net full of fish coming up, by doing what they were told, he knew who it was.
Yeah. Go ahead.
That's one thing Brent Urschel points out in his article is that they didn't believe when they saw, they believed when they heard
Yeah.
his voice.
Mm-hmm.
Because we believe by hearing the word, a lot of people see things and say they believe, but do they really believe?
Yeah.
Morgan asked me on the way here, she has a friend who knows a lot of gospel, a lot about the Bible and stuff, but she's like, Mom, how can he know all that and still cuss?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, either he truly doesn't know it's wrong or he truly doesn't care,
Right.
So maybe that's a good lesson too, that, sometimes people think they see, think they believe, but if they're not really hearing,
Mm-hmm.
do they really have true belief?
Sure. Anything else? All right, let's keep going. So in 15, they finished breakfast, and so Simon Peter, Jesus speaks to Simon, and he asked him, do you love me more than these? Now, when you look at these ideas, we've talked about a lot of the imagery here of the fish and the nets and the meal and all of those kind of ideas. And let's see. Well, there we go. Sorry. I knew I had the notes. I was like, what's going on here? All right. So when he asked, do you love me more than these? The question is, what are the these that he's talking about here? What do you think? Yeah, I think it's the other apostles. Some people have said that it was the concept of the fish. To me, that doesn't make sense based off of the imagery. Because you remember back in John 13, if you go back to John 13, here in verse 36, Simon had said, Lord, where are you going? And he said, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. Okay, so when you look at what's being done here, it seems like this was where Peter's taking this step forward. Look at what I'm doing. Look at my commitment. I'm willing to lay down my life. And it makes you wonder if the other disciples were going to do that or not. But when you look at what Jesus is bringing up, he's immediately tying back to this particular story, to this event. Because you've got the 3 times that he's appearing, and he also mentions here this denial 3 different times as well. So when you look at John 21, he's asking, do you love me more than these? And what's his response?
Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.
Yeah. Over and over and over again. Yes, yes, yes. And how many times?
3 times.
3 times. Okay? And so when you look at what he's doing, do you see the point? He's going back to, first off, the original conversion moment for Simon. And more than that, he's also playing into 13, where he made that confession about what he was going to do, as well as the 3 different times that he denied him. So he asked him 3 different times, do you love me? But further, he's also given him 1 proof, 1 appearance for every single time he's denied him. Does that make sense? I see the connections. All right, so when you look at these concepts, though, he makes a logical conclusion. Whenever he is going through and saying that he loves him, what is he expected to do?
Feed the shepherd.
Yeah, prove it. Yeah, feed.
The word Jesus is using, according to the Greek, is this self-sacrificing love that he's asking about. That's not the way that Peter answers with like a brother.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit, because there's some kind of disagreement on, like, is the key here to understand the use of the word love? But I think the word is going to be, in this context, used interchangeably. But what he does here a couple of different times is he mentions lambs, sheep, you have tend and feed, you have love used in a couple of different ways. It's almost like there's kind of a bouncing back between these words. That I guess, I don't know if it's just variety or whatever the case is, but it is still trying to drive at this idea of what's your commitment? Have you been faithful? All of those kind of ideas. Does that make sense? Okay, so when you look at all of these different pictures, you now see here in 15 going down through verse 17, he has an expectation about feeding the sheep. Okay, so Jesus is about to leave. And what did Jesus say about his sheep back there in John chapter 10? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're going to come to him, and now he's handing over this responsibility to Peter, to obviously these disciples here, but ultimately those that he's going to come in contact with as the gospel goes forward. So when you look at verse 18, after all of this, not verse 18. Let's look at verse 17. So he's grieved here. So it's because it's at the fire, because it was the 3rd time. And you see all of these different events. What is Jesus trying to do with Peter here?
Kind of reversing the denial.
Yeah.
Playing it backwards.
Yeah, so he's reversing the denial. What else is he doing? Go ahead.
Peter's willing to die for Jesus, but is he really willing to live for him?
Mm-hmm.
What do you see him doing at the very beginning? He's going back to fishing.
Yeah.
That wasn't what he was called to do. He was called to be fishers of men, not fishers of fish.
Right.
And Jesus is going to make it very clear that if you love me, it will very easy for us to say that we love Jesus. And be say that we're willing to die for him. How we're really willing to live for him through a pandemic.
Yeah. And that was the point that he had made back there in John chapter 13, right before that denial. That was when he said, I gave you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Which goes into exactly what you're talking about. And by this, all people are going to know that you're my disciples. It's good. What else? Other?
Pushing him towards commitment and driving him to want to take action. He's telling him to feed and shepherd. Those are action words. He said, you've given it to me in word. You tell me that you love me. Now show it. Do these actions. Do these things. Make these commitments.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's fascinating about this is imagine someone like Peter, who in a sense really had blown it, and had blown it really badly. And even though he had seen Jesus the first couple of times, he didn't go through all of this same kind of thing. It was like Jesus is there, he's amazed by him, all of those kind of ideas, but he doesn't say, I was wrong to deny you. Okay, he doesn't do those kind of things. And so what's happening here is not only is Peter being restored, but he's being restored back to the position he'd been originally given. Jesus hasn't given up on him, even though he had denied him. He's now put him back into that role. Do you have a comment? Okay, sorry. Other thoughts?
So, the last time the scene with the fish happened, the final charge was that he'd make them fishers of men, and I think this kind of goes along with that, but kind of a matured aspect of it, not only going out and kind of that evangelistic idea of going out and catching people, but now taking care of them and, almost more of a shepherd and elder kind of a sense, and just a greater responsibility and leadership.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's a kind of a different dynamic, like you were laying out. Other things you want to add?
Well, that's why I think that these may very well be referring to the fish. It starts out the story saying, I'm going fishing. It's almost like, I don't have anything else to do.
Yeah.
I'm going fishing. Everybody decides to go with it. And then he uses the miracle to bring Peter back to that story where he says, I've got a different purpose for you than these fish.
Mm-hmm.
And so then he's asking him, are you gonna be a fisherman? Or are you gonna feed my lambs? And, and I think that the grieving that Peter's going through here probably goes back to the 3 times that he denied him. But there's also a real tug on Peter. Are you gonna stick with what we've started together, or are you going back to your old way of life? And Peter may be struggling with that right now.
Yeah. And in this section, probably, I think it's probably safe, it's probably both. Because there's so many different images all stacked on one, like we kind of say it has to be this or that. It's likely that it's both, just because of, if you're replaying one event, but he's also replaying another event. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think you've mentioned the fact that he calls him Simon here instead of calling him Peter, because
Oh, yeah.
the difference in the meanings of the names.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, because his name was changed later, and then obviously, yeah, that's an interesting point about him being the rock and all of that concept. One of the things that I think is very interesting about this, though, is that while Jesus is pressing him, and you can imagine going through all of those events. I mean, this was an emotionally charged encounter. I mean, this is a very, very serious, very grieving time period for him. And yet Jesus isn't an enemy to him, but he is trying to deal with his heart, trying to get in there to what he really needs to do. And ultimately, like we've laid out, if he's going to have this love, he's going to have to take that forward. And by the end of this, when he's grieved, Jesus didn't settle for it the first 2 times, but it's when Peter's grieved, and then he says, Lord, you know everything, you know that I love you. He now says, you feed my sheep, and then immediately he turns into verse 18 with, okay, now you're back, here's what's going to happen to you, okay? And he is going to go through and die, and what do we know according to tradition that happened to Peter?
He's hung upside down.
Yeah, he was crucified. And what he does, if you remember, he talks about in 19, he said this to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. Does that sound familiar? That's basically what Jesus had said. When I'm lifted up, he used that to signify what kind of death. So you have the same kind of element here, that he's going to go through in the same type of vein and same type of death that he has. So, verse 19 then, here's what he says to him. Follow me. That's Luke 5, remember? That's when he had told them, go be fishers of men. That's when they left everything and followed him. So you have just so many different kind of stacked repetition here that we should read it with all of the beauty that's intended there. All right, so when you look at this concept, we may not be able to get quite all of this, but I want us to talk about these last couple of elements here. Sure, go ahead.
You have to know that Peter was very hurt over what he had done, and that he was face to face with Jesus. And Luke is the one who records Jesus looking at Peter.
Yeah.
And Peter immediately goes out and weeps because of what he's done. And so that emotion is still within Peter. And Peter may even have a feeling that Jesus doesn't want to have anything to do with him anymore. And to me, how many times have we messed up multiple times and felt like, well, surely the Lord doesn't want me because I can't ever get this right.
Yeah.
And yet, what he says about Peter is not, I've got a job for you to do, come do it. He gives him the end of the story. And the end of the story is he's going to die for Jesus.
Yeah.
Even while Peter is questioning himself, Jesus knows what his end is. And I think we need to take a lot from that. It needs to help us get through our difficult times when we mess up. Because Jesus has a confidence about our end. We'll just follow him.
Yeah.
Even
And-
after multiple messes.
Yeah, and the question, he already knew it. We talked about this back when you had Judas, who looked like a disciple, but he was a fraud. Here, Peter looks like a fraud, but he was actually a disciple. He did love the Lord. He had stumbled badly. And that kind of goes back to some of this concept. But what he's just questioning him about is what he had said, what he had committed, what he was really interested in. And that's really what, whenever we're trying to go back and talk to people, there's going to be different cases where we have to do, in essence, what Peter and Jesus are doing here. But there's certain people that you know that they love the Lord, and something's just been hard. Things have been really difficult. There's been a struggle, whatever the case is. And this is the kind of questions that we need to come back and ask them. Now, there's a couple of things that I want us to talk about as it relates to this section. And one is the idea of his death being the way that he was to glorify God. And when you think about the way God's glory works throughout the book of John, it's all the It's all the opposite of what we would normally think. So like in John chapter 9, you have a blind man, but why was he blind and suffering? Yeah, for him to be glorified, okay? When you think about Lazarus' death, I mean, just really sad situation. What did he say he died for? For his glory. I mean, it was for God's glory. And then you think about even the cross, it's the same concept, that he died to reveal the glory of God. And now here's the interesting thing about that. How often do we want our suffering or the death of a loved one to be removed and to have that person back? And yet, how can God use that? God can use that for his glory. If it's done right, if it's handled right. And that's, I think there's an important element to think about that. But further, we need to think about our own life the way that Jesus talks about Peter's life. Is our life, as well as our death, going to be one that glorifies ourselves, or is it one that glorifies God? And that's what you see here. That's what he's orienting Peter to. You're going to live a certain life. I know what you're going to do, but the question is, like you pointed out, what are we writing? Like, what is the story about us? Is it about me, or is it going to be about the Lord? And so when we look at these ideas as well, notice the way that we do that. In verse 19, that's why he tells them to follow me. That's what a life of glory looks like. That's where even a death that we give can be to his glory if it's in the process of following him. It's about following ourselves. It's not going to be for his glory. But if it is for him, then it can be for his glory. Thoughts, concepts that you want to add on that?
Just that.
Yeah.
Connecting that. I mean, him, if he is intending to say that his death would be a cross like Jesus, he's saying, follow me to that, to the same death.
Yeah.
Like the exact same. And just the whole replaying through of this, it's not, you almost get the sense that in some way, Peter still receives some kind of punishment. I don't know if his punishment is the right word, but he's singled out of the rest of them, and even in stark contrast to John, as going to be dying probably the most gruesome way and the most like Christ's, and at the culmination of this scene, that is kind of replaying his denial, but rather in conviction. I don't know. It just, there's still some way he answers for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, Peter said that he was willing to die for Jesus and then denied it. Now Jesus is saying, now you're ready.
Yeah. Yep. And let's go ahead and talk a little bit about this next section, because now they go out, Jesus sees the other disciple, and he basically asks, what about him? Okay. So he turns around and basically says, if he wants to stay until I come back, what is that to you? Okay, so first off, discipleship is not being concerned about other people. It's about me being concerned about myself and me following the Lord. Okay, it's not a competition. But further, I think it's interesting that while you can have someone's death be to the glory of God like Peter's, you can also have someone live a life like John. That he didn't go through the same things. Yeah, he went through trials and difficulties and sufferings, and yet he seemed to have lived an old life, just the way that, according to tradition, just kind of laid that out. And yet, that doesn't mean that you're always going to go through some gruesome way as the way that your death glorifies God. But did John's death and his life glorify God? It did. It did. It was different. It looked different. But regardless, the same concept is true, that they are expected to follow the Lord in both of those cases. Now, this saying here in 23 down through 24, it seems to be just one of the, or 23, just seems to be one of the things that were running around at that point. I don't know exactly what the understanding was. It seems like he's trying to kind of clarify that. But it does just kind of go through and kind of put a little bit of a book in. And then verse 24, he points out again, This is an eyewitness account. I was there. And what's beautiful about this story is, as we mentioned, there's so much unique content. And the reason that John tells a lot of this is so that we would understand what he said is true. He was there. His testimony is true. You can't find this story anywhere else because he was there. And so there's a strength that's built into it as a result of that. Okay. Other questions? Other comments? We'll talk some about the overall part of the book and some on verse 25 on Sunday. Anything else you want to add?
I think it's interesting that even at this stage, we go back to when Peter says, I'm going fishing, half of the disciples followed. I mean, there were 7 disciples that went out fishing.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a lot of influence. And we see that the dialogue that's written here by John, who's one of the characters, is with Peter.
Mm-hmm.
And we see later on how much influence Peter actually does have.
Yeah.
And how he leads the church and is a key figure in the church growing, which Christ told him he was going to be a part of.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Go ahead.
I guess it just teaches us that we need to be careful of our priorities, because there was nothing wrong with fishing in itself.
Sure.
But there were other things that were more important.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times we do lots of things that there's nothing wrong with, but it's not necessarily what is most important.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the whole thing about idolatry, just all the way across the board. It's good things becoming ultimate things, or good things that get in the way of great things. And yeah, there's definitely something to be said there. Okay, let's stop right there. And remember your project to go through and think about on Sunday. Let's have a discussion, kind of walk through some of the main things again in the gospel. And just tell me what you've learned through this process. I've done a lot of talking, so y'all can talk for a little while.